Now we're moving on to our next keynote with Lieutenant General Raj Shukla. We're very happy that he had the time to join us. He's the current Army Training Command's General Officer, Commander-in-Chief. General Shukla was a visiting scholar at the Center for Land Warfare Studies and a research fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. Over to you, gentlemen.
Dr. Yogen Narayan, Chairperson, Organizing Committee of the Global Counter-Terrorism Council, GCTC. Dr. Kamal Sibbal, Chairman of the Advisory Board, GCTC. Colleagues, past and present, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, GCTC, for the honor and the opportunity to join this conversation on the salience of space and cyber in defense. So as a soldier who grew up rooted in the numerous dimensions and nuances of the physical domains, land principally interspersed with the occasional foray into the air and maritime domains, is also regretfully a certain contempt for the cognitive domains. Soldiers don't do this space cyber kind of stuff, we were told. That is not real soldiering. I will be the first to admit that in modern warfare, not only are the physical and cognitive domains increasingly interdependent, but are also now intricately integrated. Space assets have now actually projected cyberspace into the cosmic sphere. What else is MDO, the very concept of multi-domain operations, but the skill with which we integrate, of course, space and cyber, but increasingly artificial intelligence, edge computing, the electromagnetic and cognitive information-driven domains with the traditional domains. In modern combat, integration and leveraging of capacities across domains will be decisive. So along with space and cyber, the larger story that I would like to tell, even sell, is the criticality of abandoning silos and accelerating the convergence of emerging domains and technologies into our traditional concepts and structures of war fighting. That is where, in the future, in my view, true strategic advantage will lie. Before I range more widely, let me illustrate the salience of what I have just said, integrating domains and capacities with a tactical example as to how in a few years from now, a typical MDO, multi-domain operations engagement, may unfold. So the mechanics of an MDO-enabled combat group assault on enemy dispositions enabled by cutting-edge capacities across domains, space, cyber, and what have you. So a high-space UAV system, or perhaps investments in low and medium orbital technologies, will provide the combat group commander with complete transparency of the enemy battle space through real-time persistent surveillance. This would be complemented by a Su-30 reconnaissance mission hours earlier with the imagery of key enemy dispositions offloaded into a tri-service combat cloud for instant retrieval and target designation by the staff in the combat group headquarters. Having done this, a cyber strike in terms of digital ones and zeros as part of a cyber preparatory bombardment and not a kinetic engagement could follow to substantially disable enemy radars, the command and control apparatus, and electronic warfare systems deployed opposite. Having achieved complete mastery over the battle space in terms of visual transparency, is also domination of the electromagnetic spectrum, is also some control over the enemy's command and control systems. Having been so firmly placed, the kinetics are now unleashed. Even as the traditional fire and maneuver elements of the combat groups launch the physical assaults, a swarm of offensive drones based on autonomous AI-enabled edge computing and distributed intelligence could project 30 kilometers in depth to neutralize enemy mechanized columns that are moving in for a counterattack. Now, through such smart convergence and the innovative bundling of technologies across multiple domains, a futuristic MDO-enabled combat group could achieve its mission with surgical precision in compressed time frames and at fractional costs. MDO capacities, therefore, in my view, will enhance our combat proficiencies by a significant order of magnitude. Little wonder that then that the newest combat imperative is also buzzword today is not merely joint, but joint all domain. So you have joint all domain operations, joint all domain training, joint all domain combat logistics, joint all domain command and control, etc., etc. Now, if I've been able to successfully drive home the significant advantages of integrating capacities across domains at the operational and tactical levels, let us see how the greater payoffs of integrating strategically are. So China's Strategic Support Force, acronymed PLASF, PLASSF, and the Rocket Force, acronymed PLAF, PLARF. Today, the signature projects of the PLA and the CCP are a consequence of strategic integration of thought and domain capacities. The potency of the PLA-SSF comes from the fact that it is an integrated enterprise of space and cyber, not standalone, but an integrated enterprise of space and cyber, while the Rocket Force is a formidable enterprise in firepower because it has successfully integrated precision, navigation, timing, PNT proficiencies, as also those in other tools of precisionary, hypersonics, and now artificial intelligence. Another way to look at the PLA-SSF and the PLA Rocket Force conceptually is as integrated combat repositories of excellence in non-kinetics and kinetics respectively. A good example of the equal salience accorded to kinetics and non-kinetics in the Chinese worldview. So non-kinetic anti-satellite ASAT kill capabilities, non-kinetic ASAT capabilities are resident in the PLA Strategic Support Force, while kinetic ASAT capacities are embedded in the PLA Rocket Force. So successful has been this unique experiment that both the Strategic Support Force and the Rocket Force have been designated as separate services in the Chinese armed forces, much like the Chinese Army, the Chinese Navy, and the Chinese Air Force. They are distinct, separate services. The Americans similarly are now growing their Space Force as a separate and distinct service in the manner of the US Army, the US Air Force, the US Navy, and the US Marines. Even in an era of budgetary constraints and drawdowns, the only US command to be elevated to combatant command status was space. It gave the USA its 11th combatant command. The United Kingdom's Strategic Futures Command has been stood up with the express mission of integrating capacities in space and cyber with the traditional domains of land, air, and sea. In the Indian context, even as we grow our nascent Defense Space Agency, the DSA, and the Defense Cyber Agency, the DCYA, integration of domain capacities must be the underlying theme. When you have these cylinders of excellence, why build walls of granite between them? That seems to be the operational logic world over. Merely standing up these entities also, may I say, will not be good enough. They need to be undergirded, serviced by a larger conceptual framework and shaped by a clearly thought through strategic frame. I mean, how do we grow them into centers of excellence in kinetics, centers of excellence in non-kinetics? That should be the thought. Else they shall manifest in suboptimal avatars. So we need to make the really right and smart choices here. Yesterday's thinking will not be good enough to measure up to tomorrow's challenges. And there are many models to take inspiration from. The American model that I just spoke of, the Chinese model, or even the British model. Or we could emulate the Israeli model, one that emphasizes quality, talent, and enterprise over military bureaucracies. One that is flat, fleet-footed, and technologically the best in the world. No elaborate strategies for the Israelis, no laborious doctrines, but merely prescient action in two combat units which have specialized and excel in cyber and space. The Unit 8200 and the Unit 9300, which did such a remarkable job even in the recent Israeli offensive into the Gaza Strip. So what is the Unit 8200? It comprises, I'm told, of 18 to 21-year-olds with unique career paths. So they spend 5 to 7 years in the Unit 8200, and many of them go onwards to the Silicon Valley. And these relationships continue to grow or to service and grow the Unit 8200. And therefore, this unit has had remarkable successes, such as with the Stuxnet operation, the hacking of the Kaspersky lab, deactivating of Syrian air defenses in the undeclared attack on the Syrian nuclear reactor. It really excels in cyber and SIGINT and operates 24/7. It is not one of these larger bureaucratic organizations like the Space Command. I mean, there are options. There are pros and cons of both, but here is a good example. And here, both in the Unit 8200, which specializes in cyber and SIGINT, the talent pipelines are the key. How you get these youngsters in, how you utilize them, and allow them to grow outside. Unit 9300 is similarly, shall I say, resourced in the human dimension and specializes in space int, visual int, geospatial int, satellite imagery interpretation, GPS leveraging, photo analysis, now I'm told AR, VR, terrain mapping, interpretation, so on and so forth. In a sense, learning and growing in the Israeli context occurs in these real laboratories who are given real-time operational tasks. This too is a model that we could think of emulating. Allow me now to turn to the specific domains of space and cyber very briefly, and within the ambits of each, I shall make a few quick points for your consideration. Space first. Now, there are signs that in the near future, life may successfully break out of planet Earth into space. Both Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk certainly think so. Much of the pussyfooting about not militarizing space, thankfully, has also ceased. Space in the future could emerge as an arena of life and residence for humans, but it is a clear fact that space is no longer a peaceful and benign domain. It has already emerged as a distinct domain of intense competition, contestation, and war fighting. That is a settled matter. Today, about 90 spacefaring nations have 2,600 active orbiting satellites in space. Some 57,000 additional satellites, I'm told, are on the drawing board. At the turn of the century, just by way of example, China had a mere 24 satellites. Today, it launches 100 satellites every year, many more than the USA. There is a growing proclivity, as we all know, towards anti-satellite weapons. But the point that I would really like to make is this, that nations are investing vigorously to bolster their presence in space. And the logic is pretty simple. The more frequent your forays into space, says Jeff Bezos, the shorter your lead times and the lower your costs, the greater will be your formidability as a space power. Enhanced presence in space will mean more frequent visits and revisits, which in turn will enhance your ability to protect Earth-borne military assets and pieces of tactical terrain. Quite naturally, therefore, while the Americans have already had a large footprint in space, the Chinese are now following suit, and very aggressively so. But the central tenet of both the American and the Chinese forays into the space domain, and this is important for lessons in the Indian context, which I would like you to consider, is the dramatic fusion of civil and military capacities. Civil military fusion, as they say. In case of China, it is referred to as MCF, or military civil fusion, perhaps because the military is in the lead. MCF, as we all know, is also an ideological mooring of the CCP, driven at the highest level by President Xi. The Americans have fused the talent and capacities of NASA, the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, private sector players. Elon Musk is actively integrated into the space program of the US Air Force. So Musk, Bezos, and the US Space Com, NASA, NRO, Musk, Bezos, and the US Space Com, all the talent available in the United States comes together to build this integrated business model and combat enterprise for growing American capacities in space. Now, such an enterprise flows from the acknowledgement and the humility that no single organization on its own, neither the US military, nor NASA, nor NRO, nor Elon Musk, nobody on their own can secure space in the interests of the American nation. So military, science, business, R&D, startups, entrepreneurs, everybody comes together to give space a thrust in the case of the United Nations. And no wonder they are the lead player insofar as securing space for national security and national interests are concerned. What do the Chinese do? What is the Chinese MCF all about? Well, the Chinese take a long view which is fixated in the timeline of 2035. So how do we secure Chinese interests in space, Chinese capacities in war fighting in space to grow in an integrated manner up to 2035? And the MCF is authored, of course, driven by President Xi, but the details are authored by no less than Premier Li Keqiang. And it emphasizes on excellence in semiconductor, space, aerospace, deep space, robotic missions to moon, building of space stations, war fighting, reinvigorating informational power. Look at the integrated approach. If you have this kind of integrated approach in capacities, talents, you will obviously profit. There is convergence in acquisitions, huge savings in cost, no separate acquisition channels for the military and for the civilian segments of space. So this whole enterprise seeks to integrate skills of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, industries, startups, R&D laboratories, and so on. And so the best minds in space are sponsored as part of the 1,000 Talents Plan to the best universities across the globe. They come back and resource the whole Chinese endeavor in space. And at the end of it, they draw up a precise roadmap. Substantial meta-strategic investments are ensured. Talent from all spaces is harnessed, and there is a specific clause which says that this whole MCF plan will give a fillip to dual purpose and military potential technologies from civil industry and labs to build up the capacities of the PLA in space. Once again, classical integration and MCF. So if Indian military capacities in space have to grow with speed and precision, MCF, in my view, will be the key. The other lesson that we need to emulate in the Indian context is that our own Defense Space Agency needs to evolve rapidly and efficiently into a space force, one that can protect ISRO and DSA assets in space. In the USA, we may like to note, the responsibility of maneuvering commercial NRO satellites and protecting them in the case of a national security event is that of SpaceCom and not NRO. So even in our case, our interactions with the ISRO and the NTRO need to be integrated from shall I say, womb to tomb. It also needs to energize its combat operations across domains, specifically in the spheres of ISR targeting, precisionary, electronic warfare, and information operations. That, I presume, is stating the obvious. The DSA needs to be given a strong combat focus with a clear mandate, perhaps a designated AOR above 100 kilometers, as also a robust protect and defend mission. I'm not saying that this is not being done. I'm merely emphasizing the fact that it needs to acquire this very strong combat focus, because today there's no doubt that space is a war-fighting domain. It needs to structure a precise plan to establish space superiority. Now, this means resourcing it in various ways, from concepts to capacities. We also need to leverage the explosion in commercial space. And this is the point that I would like to emphasize. Commercial space, private sector competencies, academia, startups to craft a defense space domain enterprise with distinct ownership and control over orbital planning, especially in the low and medium orbits, because that is where much of your tactical and operational spin-offs come from. We need collaborators to enhance our proficiencies in various domains, but just to name a few critical ones: hyperspectral loads that facilitate elaborate ISR, to include detection to camouflage. We need capabilities in orbital transfer vehicles for efficient and cost-effective launches, so on and so forth. So these are the 2 points that I wanted to make with regard to space. And the point that I made earlier, may I just emphasize that there is also a need to set up a robust interface mechanism with the NTRO and the ISRO as the first step, and thereafter try and emulate global best practices in civil-military fusion that I spoke about. Cyber. Before I come to the salience and role of a coherent cyber strategy and a potent cyber response mechanism, Defense Cyber Agency or Cyber Command, what have you, let me briefly establish the context, reiterate some facts, and make a few propositions. So cyberspace is the only man-made global common, as we all know, and one that is continuously expanding. As part of the global IoT, I'm told today, some 60 billion devices are hooked to the internet. It is an arena where low-end hackers, violent extremists, non-state actors, and nation states all seek to prevail, each growing increasingly capable, aggressive, and sophisticated. This is a point to be noted. It is also a global theater of brutal great power and state-to-state competition, with nations aspiring to strategic advantage today through cyber espionage, IP theft, intellectual property theft, the shaping of narratives, running influence operations, as also by undermining the legitimacy of adversary political systems. North Korea, I'm told, used cyber exploitation of financial systems to evade sanctions. So the cyberspace is being used for various geopolitical purposes. The American 2020 election, after all, we may like to note, had to be secured as much by the US Federal Election Commission as an unshackled US Cyber Command. So without the US Cyber Command, the 2020 American elections may not have been secure. In some contrast, leaders of the then fledgling US Cyber Command. Now this is a point, when the Cyber Command was fledgling, shackled, see what happened. The leaders of the US Cyber Command learned of US meddling in the elections of 2016 only through the newspapers. But when you unshackle the Cyber Command in 2020, it plays an active role in securing American elections. This is another aspect that we need to consider, how these silos, military civil silos, simply need to break down. I'm told the US Space Com or the US, the US CENTCOM played the Cybercom played a major role in tackling some of these vulnerabilities in Windows 10 along with Microsoft. So see the domains in which the military is now getting together with the areas of civil expertise. So protecting virtual spaces through defensive and offensive capacities in cyber for any nation, therefore, is a huge ask, a big challenge. Attribution too is extremely difficult, with nation states obscuring identity by establishing relationships with non-state actors. Look at the sophistication. And at critical moments in a cyber attack sequence, initiating the switch to the non-state actor. So attributability is difficult. Cyber signaling is getting deft, it's getting smart and sophisticated. So nations are planting visible codes in the adversary infrastructure grid to dissuade further cyber attacks. Stop or else is the message. In the midst of all this, full-scale deterrence is not easy to achieve. Now, acknowledging cyber as an area of growing civil specialization and appreciating the national security consequences, what are nations doing? Some of them have appointed ministers for digital affairs. The US, I'm told, is considering setting up a digital service with the best military and civil minds. They are looking at digital service academies to train professionals in managing digital affairs. So that is how important cyber and the digital space is becoming. Closer home, we all know that India's internet proliferation is exponential in nature. It is second only to China. Indian social media users, Facebook and Instagram, are probably larger than the numbers in China. 40% of our population is yet to get connected. And when it does, as it inevitably will, the Indian cyberspace will also grow even larger. As the Indian military gets more digital, as its data concentrations grow, its digital networks proliferate, as it embraces 5G and deploys IoT devices along the borders, its cyber vulnerability, of course the capacities will grow, but its cyber vulnerabilities will also grow by an order of magnitude. So protecting the Indian cyber space, already an onerous task, will become a humongous challenge indeed. Yet there are those that posit that US Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta's famous and dire warning about a cyber Pearl Harbor has not really come true. So there is nothing really to worry about. Yes, there are everyday cyber disruptions. They are probing attacks on infrastructure grids and defense networks. US defense DoD networks are probed some 10 million times a day, I'm told. There have been election hacks. We've heard of other breaches, the Sony hack, OPM, SolarWinds, very recently an attack on the Mumbai power grid. But we have not really seen a massive cyber attack where hundreds of thousands have really died. A cyber Pearl Harbor has not quite occurred. So what is this big deal about cyber? Well, the big deal in my view is this. There is overwhelming evidence of malign and hostile cyber capacity. We need to brace up to the capacity, ever growing in sophistication and nuance as I recounted. For as the old maxim goes, capacities take generations to create, while intent can change overnight. And when that cyber intent does change, we should not be found wanting, either by way of capacity or response. Even as we speak, countries are developing philosophies and viewing capacities in offensive cyber to derail entire cities, to make them uninhabitable for weeks, by creating a space-denied environment, for example, collapsing banking systems and power grids, by targeting transportation networks, by causing railroad switching signals to malfunction, by exploiting cyber vulnerabilities in our sewage systems, ATMs, cell phone services, and nuclear power plants. All this is being thought about, it is being planned, it may be an occurrence in the near future. In consequence, in their cyber strategizing, therefore, many nations have contemplated a nuclear first strike by way of response to a massive cyber strike of this kind that I referred to. So there is a great deal about the cyber domain that we need to worry about, agitate about, and think through. All these things that I mentioned have to be thought through. I'm sure much of it is being done, but I think we need to go much deeper into this whole challenge in the cyber world. With that as the broad context, a few thoughts on India's cyber response strategy and structures. Well, we were late of the starting blocks in setting up the Defense Cyber Agency, as we all know. So very honestly, we have a lot of catching up to do in terms of building up our ideation, thoughts, protocols, and given the sheer sophistication of the threat paradigm, our tradecraft. Tradecraft takes a long time to build. We will need to upgrade capacity significantly, develop leverages to generate fresh insights into cyber. It's a game which is changing every day. Look at cost imposition options. So if a nation state attacks you, perhaps if you go public, there could be exposure embarrassment costs. But what do you do? What cost do you impose when a non-state actor attacks you? And what do you do when there are only discrete linkages between nation states and non-state actors, as I said? So this is a domain that we need to think through. We need to examine the relevance and utility of emerging concepts in cyber in the Indian context. And these are being discussed worldwide, like persistent engagement, which basically says that don't sit back for a cyber attack to hit you, but go out, defend forward, hunt forward, which is basically targeting adversary systems and for our grids, of course, with political sanction and according to the laws of the land, but these things need to be done. We need perhaps to configure a new talent pipeline for cyber and space, as I spoke about. I also learned, to my great surprise, that some time back, at least 2 years back in the US, I don't know if things have changed of late, the retention rates of the NSA and the US cyber and space com were much higher than the big tech companies. So people come into these domains not for the love of money alone, but for other issues as well. But yet that does not come in the way of us looking at exquisite talent pipelines if we have to really energize the space and cyber domains. There's also revisit our very cultural outlook towards space and cyber, which I alluded to in the beginning, that real militaries don't do this kind of stuff. I mean, that's quite a legacy thought now. Cyber operations need to complement conventional operations more effectively. And this is again a very challenging domain. Warfighters need a better understanding of space and cyber, while space and cyber operators need to have an equally intimate understanding of warfighting. This is not the case at the moment, I would regretfully state. Cyber capacities need to devolve rapidly to the field along our northern and western borders, as to evolve in scale and capacity beyond websites. We need to have potent cyber capacities in the field And if we do so, there'll be a huge force multiplier, as also substantially boost our capacities in multi-domain operations, as I said. One last point, if I may, about the macro strategy in cyber. Thus far, the advantage in cyber lay in offense. So you deterred by hunting forward into adversary networks, and the very offensive lies, since the adversary knew that you were into their networks and you could cause damage, that caused deterrence. That deterred the adversary from launching cyber attacks. Now, developments in quantum technologies, I'm told, with the impossible to break codes, I'm told these developments in quantum technologies will shift the advantage back in cyber from offense to defense. If true, this conference may like to ponder over the implications of the same on our cyber strategy. So let me conclude by saying this. Space and cyber, the cosmic and virtual worlds, are central to India's national security and prosperity. We need to address the challenges and opportunities in the twin domains, not by incrementalism, but through the greatest of imagination and creativity to evolve a uniquely Indian way of defending our space and cyber frontiers. Thank you for a very patient hearing, and Jai Hind.
Raj Shukla, it's always a pleasure to listen to you, and fantastic to meet you again in the pandemic time through the virtual mode. Before I ask a couple of questions on the cyber domain, since you spoke first in the space domain, I would like to take the opportunity to help our audience understand. There is obviously an extensive need as far as the military space domain aspects are concerned. It has just started at the nascent stage, primarily in terms of organization with the DMA and the CDS creation. What is the current status as far as the cyber in the space domain in terms of the penetration, in terms of the building capabilities, in terms of talent? Where do you see the Indian military status in these two domains currently? Is it just at the thought, in the ideas, the papers, or we see some development on the ground happening?
Well, let me say this, that the fact that we have set up the DSA and the Defense Cyber Agency after years of debate is itself a big step. But as I recounted to you, and very honestly from the way the world has moved in these two domains, I'll be the first to admit that we have a very long way to go, both in space and cyber. The advantage we perhaps have in space is that our civilian capacities in space are pretty mature. So the transition to equivalent military capacities in space will perhaps be that much faster and more rapid. But as I was trying to bring out to you, what is more important is that when we think of energizing the DSA and the Defense Cyber Agency, they were the larger issues that I made in the beginning. We have to put them into a strategic frame. For example, the manner in which the Chinese have grown non-kinetic strategically, kinetic strategically. Those are some of the issues that we need to apply our minds to, and I'm sure that is being done. At the moment, I presume what is being done is in the establishment of these agencies, you are settling down as a structure, growing state, tradecraft, looking at these talent pipelines. All these things are happening. But if you compare with what, say, the Israelis are doing, or what the Americans have done, or what the Chinese have done, in both these domains, we have a long way to go, and I'm sure we are all, quite seized of the challenge. And but equally, there are opportunities because, say, in the cyberspace, the Indians are supposed to be the best in software, the best in digital kind of stuff. So I would say three things: that we started late, the challenge is huge, but we can close the gap very quickly, given our natural capacities in these two domains.
Okay, that was my follow-up question. What you mentioned, Raj Shukla, whether the NTRO will take it forward, or the ISRO will take it forward, or a combination of it will take it forward. Because, as you mentioned, we have a existing civil domain pretty mature and one of the best in the world in space. But obviously, which agency will take it forward? That's going to be the key aspect as far as the military domain is concerned. Any movement on that particular front, or it's still being worked upon, or you see a combination of these agencies, including the new privatized domains, like the new space policy that was announced last year? Uh, how do you see this moving? NTRO way, ISRO way, military developing on its own, or the privatized players?
See, I would have insider knowledge because these two agencies don't come directly under me. I don't deal with them. But there's no doubt that there is only one way, and that is the integrated way. The NTRO, the ISRO, and the armed forces have to come together. And that is by example, I told you in the US, how NASA, NRO, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the US Space Com are coming together. The Chinese is a similar example of MCF. And the logic is quite simple because no one organization has the innate capacity to take on these huge challenges. And the other challenge, I think a very good example was given by Jeff Bezos. He said, why should we look for customized solutions? Why don't we look for integrated solutions? And the example he gave was that, say, the military has a doctor which tends only to the military. Now, this doctor will not grow in expertise. So the military and these commercial and the other segments, civilian segments, should look at doctors who have multiple expertise. So I'm quite convinced that the way forward is integration. As far as private sector and startups, I mean, these are the directions from the Honorable Prime Minister. And I think over the last 1.5 years, we've opened up in a big way to business, startups, entrepreneurs. Within ARTRAC, we do a lot of R&D on these aspects. And many of these research and defense initiatives, the fundings have gone to the startups. Offensive swarming of drones was by Sameer Joshi, a startup. So a short answer to your question, the way forward is integrated, and we have to get all competencies together. It is not NTRO versus ISRO or ISRO versus the armed forces. All three have to get into this act together. And there are national spin-offs from the civil segment to the military segment and vice versa. A good example is Huawei, because Huawei powered the 5G experiment in China, and the PLA was built into it. Today, I'm told that there are these huge experiments going on in China on facial recognition or autonomous vehicles, and PLA teams are embedded. So when you have this embedded approach, pay off your proficiencies in both domains, brush off on each other. And so you transit with these proficiencies to the borders much quickly, much faster. And therefore, I'm told the 5G is manifesting in the Western Theatre Command. So integration, convergence is the way forward. Bundling of technologies, talent, and capacities and organizations. That's what I would say.
Certainly. Sir, you mentioned multiple models, the Chinese, the US, the Israeli, which, in your opinion, would be the most suitable for India? Is it the scaling up model, or Israeli, Chinese, US? Which one is going to be most suitable for us? Because we have started late, but at the same time, as you mentioned, that we have an opportunity to quickly pick up.
You see, in these kind of domains, you need two things. You need scale and velocity. So scale, given the nature of our threats, I tried to explain to you the volume of our cyberspace and the kind of capacities we need in space would suggest that we need scale. But the problem with scale is that when you go into these, huge agencies and commands, bureaucracies creep in. So the velocity of decision making reduces. So velocity comes from flat structures. The Israeli units are remarkable because they provide flat structures. But those structures, I think their utility comes primarily from their talent pipelines. Now, whether we can do that in the Indian context, get these young people who excel in space and cyber, 5 to 6 years, let them go. So these these career pathways in space and cyber, I know for sure that in the Army, we are taking a very close look at it. The Chief has ordered that we take a clear look at this, that how could we evolve unique pathways for space and cyber. So I've given you the advantages. You do need scale, but that scale should not be hampered by bureaucracy. The scale should be propelled by velocity. and the talent model comes from the Israeli units that I spoke of. So it's very difficult to give you an instant answer, but the people who are intimately connected with it, I'm sure they're looking at all three of them, seeing what is in our best interest, and also linking it with the larger strategic purpose, which I spoke of. Exclusive repositories of kinetics, non-kinetics. So since we are just getting started, I think it's a good time to take a quick review of all this and come to the best structures in our national security interest.
Okay, Janshullah, a couple of last questions. You see the startups, the incubation of both, and I refer to the cyber and the space domains, being the effective model in Indian case, specifically with the two departments that we have created now. The startups could be providing the solution.
I think the startups are huge accelerators. And in the defense domain, at least in the army, what I've seen, they are oozing with talent, energy, enthusiasm, innovation, and enterprise. If I may make this point, technology is not only about technology. It's not about technology per se. Technology is useless unless it is accompanied by bureaucratic agility, innovation, energy, enterprise. And this latter bit comes, in larger measure from the startups. And there are a lot of initiatives in the MOD and the Delhi. When I was DGPP, I was quite intimately connected with that. Of late, I've been a little out of touch. But I know that the ADB, which looks at these startups, is very enthused. In the ARTRAC, we are doing a lot of stuff with them. Startups, academia. So we have somebody, designing a low light imaging chip. We have a Bangalore startup garage innovator who's looking into laser, all kinds of stuff. Much of the stuff which Anup Mishra did in the domain of lethality and personal security came from startups. So I'm a big enthusiast about startups. We are encouraging them in a big way. I wonder what the startups think of us. And have a lot of this converted into orders? In my view, yes, but there is always scope for improvement. But the bottom line is that startups, in my view, will really energize the defense sector. And not that the other domains are not doing well. I mean, DRDO, Bell, and the others, they are. But now there is healthy competition, which is going to sharpen our combat edge and our military industrial edge. So I think startups have been a real boon. The idea has been very, very good.
I have a last question, Raj Shukla. When you look at the talent pool, and that is something you mentioned specifically, how the retention rate is pretty high in US. We have seen some similar problem in the say the software industry. Half of the world's softwares are run by the Indians, developed by the Indians. We do have that issue as far as the Indian economy, Indian society, and obviously a bit of it in the Indian military institutions are concerned. Retaining the talent. How do you see that's being solved? What do we need to do? Obviously, just the handsome pay package can't solve the problem. Are we doing enough? And what if not? What is that we need to do to ensure that all these talent pool remains for a long time with us?
Okay, so let me just put the point that I made in context. I saw this interview. I think it is of the commander-in-chief of the US Space Com. And if I'm not mistaken, he's Admiral Rogers. I may be getting the name wrong, but the point is absolutely authentic. And the point that he made was this, that about 2 years back, when he looked at the talent retention rate in the NSA and the US Space Com, it was of the order of 96 to 97%. So just 4% were exiting. And that came as a pleasant surprise to me. And he said that when he interacted with the bosses of the big tech companies, they were having greater problems in retaining talent, even though the pay scales are much higher. And so the point that he makes is that it is not pay scales alone, but the fact that, it's a sense of prestige that you are associated with the apex strategic endeavors of the nation. You are doing something of great value. But he says you have to be flexible about other issues. He gave a very good example of how these youngsters look at digital freedoms. So if you tell him that you will not carry your mobile into this secure facility for 24 hours, that puts him off. So a little more flexibility in all this, in not getting them trapped in military cultures, which is very tradition bound. If you can be a little more flexible in how you interact with them. So in talent retention, and I would urge you to look at this conversation, it's on YouTube, there were factors other than mere pay and perks. So if that is the American experience in this, I'm sure in the Indian case, we also know that many years back, Ash Carter, I don't know whether it actually got implemented, I think it did, he structured an entirely different, shall I say, cadre structure for these space and cyber geeks. He said they would come in directly at, say, at the lieutenant colonel level, work for 10 years and then go out as a colonel or something. Because those kind of people already have a job assuredness outside. They are looking at a sense of, shall I say, satisfaction, association with military and strategic projects. So they are coming in for different reasons. So the bottom line is that for some time I thought that there was natural hostility between the needs of the armed forces in these specialist domains and what the talent pipeline had to offer. Of late, I'm of the view that there is no such hostility. There could be convergence, and we could tap it to mutual advantage.
Okay. Thank you so much. On that note, General Shukla, it is always a pleasure interacting with you, and this is something that not only just in the military, media, the strategic thinkers, think tanks, everyone will be looking forward to in the upcoming years. And these have just begun, the cyber in the space in the military domain. And we have a certainly long way to go and a lot to catch up and learn. Thank you so much, General Shukla.
Thank you, Ashish, for the opportunity and the invite. Great pleasure.
Thank you to General Shukla for that tour de force presentation on the topic that we're going to be covering next, cyber and information warfare, the changing contours of warfighting. And he mentioned the retention of talent of the sort of people who want to continue to serve the nation. And this is a panel full of people like that who have made the decision to put their incredible talents and expertise to the service of their nations.